Imagine you have uh, exactly zero point 0.3 seconds before 1 ton of physical force just violently crushes your chest.
Right, which is, I mean, your brain literally doesn't even have the physical time to process the thought, I am in danger, before the impact hits.
Exactly. Just picture yourself standing there. In less time than it takes for your eyelid to complete a single blink, a literal ton of kinetic energy is going to impact your core.
Yeah.
Biologically, your nervous system does not even have the time required to, send a signal to your brain, form a conscious thought, and then send a signal back to your muscles to brace.
No, the impact hits before your intellect even knows what's happening.
Right. And so the question we're asking today is, are you equipped to survive that?
It's the ultimate stress test of human biology, really. But it also serves as this perfect metaphor for what we are exploring today.
Yeah, the bigger question.
Exactly. When a truly unpredictable, catastrophic black swan event strikes, are we actually equipped to survive it? Like, is our modern society, with all of our carefully written protocols and, step-by-step compliance manuals and rigid top-down structures, is it built to withstand a shock that just instantly shatters baseline reality?
And spoiler alert, the answer we found in the sources is a pretty resounding no.
Yeah, a terrifying no, honestly.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at what happens when our rigid, manual-driven world meets one of those catastrophic black swans. And to do this, we've got a stack of sources today that at first glance feels completely disjointed.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really wild mix.
Right, because first we are pulling from the official accident report of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, which is the tragic Boeing 737 MAX crash.
That's a heavy document.
It is. But then we are combining that with medical trauma standards on extreme physical survival.
Which seems totally unrelated.
Exactly. And then crossing all of that with highly classified strategic manuals from an advisory group known as Strategist Kongming AAA.
All right, the Architect Anti-Fragile Advisory. Plus, we have their recent intelligence updates on the Himalayan region.
It's a lot, but the underlying thread here is actually deeply profound.
It really is, because all these documents address the exact same cognitive and structural mechanisms. They show why standard top-down instructions just fail us so miserably in a crisis.
Right.
And crucially, we're going to unpack how intentionally rewriting your internal operating system, whether that's, your biological nervous system or a multinational corporate structure, how doing that can turn a devastating impact into a massive evolutionary leap forward.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out how to successfully upgrade that OS, I think we first need to diagnose the fatal flaw in the old one.
We have to look at what happens when a rigid system just utterly collapses under pressure.
Yeah. Let's put you, the listener, inside the cockpit of that Boeing 737 MX Flight 302.
The cascading failures in this official report, they just paint a terrifying picture of misplaced engineering faith.
They really do. And
Yeah.
the foundational error wasn't just mechanical, right? It was philosophical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To understand the failure, you have to look at the engineering delusion that set the stage. Boeing's engineers basically designed the flight control system with a single point of failure.
Which is wild.
It is. It was a single angle of attack sensor, or AOA sensor, which basically measures the pitch of the plane.
Right. And shortly after takeoff, that single sensor feeds incorrect data into the plane's software. Just one bad data point.
Yep.
And that triggers a background system called MCS. The software incorrectly calculates that the plane's nose is pitched dangerously high.
So it autonomously begins forcing the nose down toward the ground.
And this is where that top-down mindset reveals its absolute fragility.
Yeah, because the engineers assumed that if this newly implemented and honestly largely undocumented software malfunctioned, the human beings in the cockpit would act as the ultimate failsafe.
Like they're just backups for the computer.
Exactly. The assumption was the pilots would, calmly recognize the specific software issue, open their emergency manuals, and just sequentially execute a standard runaway stabilizer checklist.
Which is insane when you look at the reality. The system treated the pilots like perfectly rational, emotionless subroutines capable of debugging code in midair.
Right. Completely ignoring the biological reality of human beings under extreme duress.
Yeah, let's look at the actual sensory environment of that cockpit during those fatal minutes.
That's horrifying.
Within seconds, the pilots are hit with just an overwhelming wall of cognitive terror. The stick shaker mechanism is violently rattling the steering column in their hands.
Which physically simulates that the plane is stalling out and falling from the sky.
Right. And that physical vibration, it triggers an immediate sympathetic nervous system response. It demands the brain's full attention.
You can't ignore it.
No, And simultaneously, an overspeed clacker is firing off at a deafening volume, telling them they're flying too fast.
Since they have the stick shaker saying they're stalling.
And the clacker saying they're too fast. Meanwhile, the automated ground proximity warning system is screaming, "Don't sink, don't sink."
So they are being bombarded with entirely contradictory warnings, all at peak volume.
And physically, the situation is degrading just as fast. Because the plane is pitching down at high speeds, massive aerodynamic forces lock up the manual trim wheel.
Yeah, the pilots are physically fighting against the weight of the airframe.
They were pulling back on the control column with up to 110 pounds of sustained physical force just to keep the nose up.
Think about that physical exertion.
Exactly. You are wrestling a massive machine with 110 pounds of raw effort, the alarms are deafening, the systems are lying to you, and you're supposed to correctly diagnose a background software glitch by flipping through a paper manual.
It's absurd. It's basically like trying to read a software manual through a strobe light while a fire alarm is blaring right in your ear.
That's a great way to put it. The cognitive bandwidth required for reading and processing instructions is just completely consumed by sensory panic.
Yeah, and that visual perfectly captures what aviation psychologists call the startle effect.
The startle effect, right?
When the brain is flooded with that level of acute contradictory sensory input, the amygdala essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex.
Which is the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning, right?
Exactly. Logic, reading, complex problem solving, it all just shuts down. The pilots were highly trained, but they were trapped in an impossible paradox.
Yeah.
They were desperately trying to intellectually decode a technical manual while their failing aircraft demanded raw, intuitive, immediate physical intervention. Their cognitive processing was completely jammed.
So if conscious processing jams up that quickly under pressure, biology must have built a back door.
It has to have.
Right. Otherwise, our ancestors would never have survived sudden, violent encounters. There has to be a biological bypass that circumvents the prefrontal cortex entirely.
And there is. To understand the mechanics of it, we turn to those medical and cognitive science sources we mentioned.
This is where the deep dive gets truly astonishing.
Yeah, the contrast to the cockpit paralysis is radical.
We have this highly documented medical account of a man who survived a direct one-ton kick from a racehorse. The sources refer to this as a Kuduba kick.
Right.
And the entire impact occurred in that exact 0.3-second window we talked about at the top of the show.
Yeah. To really appreciate the magnitude of this, we have to establish the biological baseline.
Okay.
According to standard medical trauma literature, if you subject a normal human abdomen to a one-ton blunt force impact, the conscious brain triggers that exact same startle reflex we just discussed.
The victim freezes.
Exactly. The abdominal wall offers zero muscular resistance. The medical texts use a very vivid, grim descriptor.
I remember this.
They say the hydrostatic shock waves of a one-ton impact turn the human midsection to tofu.
Wow. Kofu.
Yeah. The kinetic energy instantly ruptures the hollow organs, pulverizes the solid organs, and shatters the skeletal structure.
So the baseline is a guaranteed instant fatality.
Basically.
But this man survives, and he walks away.
He does.
And the sources are emphatic that this was not a miracle or dumb luck. He survived because he intentionally hacked his own physical operating system using dual task training.
It sounds bizarre, but it worked.
It is bizarre. He spent years performing physical squats on a highly unstable rubber balance ball while simultaneously singing complex songs out loud.
Yeah.
Now, I understand the concept of distraction, but how does singing a song physically stop a ribcage from shattering under a ton of force?
I know, it sounds like a parlor trick until you map the neurology.
Okay, map it out for us.
Think of the cerebral cortex, so the conscious thinking part of your brain that handles language and logic. Think of that as the CEO of a company.
Okay, the CEO.
By forcing the CEO to focus intensely on the highly complex conscious task of remembering lyrics, maintaining pitch, and projecting his voice, he effectively occupied his higher brain's entire bandwidth.
He intentionally gave the CEO busy work.
Precisely. And by occupying the CEO, he forced the deeper, older parts of the brain, specifically the brainstem and the cerebellum, to autonomously take over the vital task of keeping his body balanced on that unstable rubber ball.
Oh, wow.
He was systematically programming his nervous system to manage physical defense without waiting for conscious permission.
So when the horse actually kicked him, his brain didn't waste time sending a memo to the CEO to ask what to do.
Exactly. Because the CEO was trained to stay out of the way, the impact triggered an ultra-fast neural pathway called the reticulospinal tract.
The reticulospinal tract.
Yeah, and this creates what neurologists call the start-react effect. It bypasses the cortical pathways entirely. His core muscles locked with absolute rigidity autonomously, fractions of a second before the conscious thought of danger could even form.
He essentially built an autonomous ODO loop.
Exactly.
The military strategy loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act. Normally, that's a conscious decision-making process, but if you have to consciously process an ODA loop in 0.3 seconds, you're dead.
You are.
His nervous system observed, oriented, decided, and acted purely on reflex. And the architectural analogy the sources use to explain this physiological state is just brilliant. They call it Fudo no Shinbashira, the unbreakable core pillar.
It's a perfect analogy. The mechanics map perfectly onto human anatomy.
Right, because a traditional Japanese pagoda doesn't survive massive earthquakes by having rigid, unyielding external walls that fight the seismic waves.
If it did, it would shatter.
Right. Instead, it features a massive central wooden pillar suspended inside the structure. When the shock waves hit, that central pillar sways, absorbs, and dissipates the kinetic energy without snapping.
And his artificially hardened core muscles acted exactly like that central pillar. He absorbed a ton of kinetic energy and dissipated it.
Wow.
If we bring this concept back to the Boeing pilots, imagine if their training had successfully installed an autonomous ODA loop for that specific mechanical failure.
Oh, man. If they had an instinctive crisis operating system, they wouldn't have lost those critical seconds trying to intellectually decode a manual.
Right. Their autonomous OS would have bypassed the cognitive overload of the blaring alarms, prompting their hands to intuitively correct the trim first and diagnose the software second.
That is the crucial difference between a fragile system reliant on instructions and an anti-fragile system reliant on instinct.
Yeah. But, transitioning from an individual to an organization introduces a massive layer of complexity.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can clearly see how one incredibly dedicated person can spend years on a rubber ball rewiring their own reticulospinal tract. That makes structural sense for human biology.
Yeah, it's possible for one person.
But how do you scale a biological reflex? Like, how do you take an instinctive survival mechanism and install it into a sprawling, naturally rigid corporate organization?
And that is the exact operational mission of the organization detailed in our classified sources.
Strategist Comming AAA.
Exactly. The Architect Anti-Fragile Advisory. Their entire methodology for upgrading organizational operating systems is anchored in a very specific mathematical principle.
Right, this is where it gets crazy.
-3 multiplied by -3 equals +9.
It sounds like a motivational poster, honestly. But the mechanics behind this math are fascinating. Walk us through the logic. How does -3 times -3 equal 9 actually function in a real-world strategic environment?
Okay, let's construct a scenario. A massive black swan event strikes a company.
Like a supply chain collapse or a new disruptive tech?
Yeah, exactly. That event is the initial -3 shock. The standard corporate instinct in the face of this shock is to aim for resilience.
It's a bounce back.
Right. A company tries to absorb the blow, mitigate the immediate financial damage, and get back to their comfortable pre-crisis baseline. Let's assign that safe baseline a value of +3.
That seems entirely logical to most boards. Weather the storm, stabilize the stock, get things back to normal.
But strategist Kong Ming argues that resilience is a dangerous, fragile delusion.
Because of the math.
Exactly. Because if you multiply the initial shock, the -3, by your standard safe recovery effort, the +3, mathematically and structurally, you end up at a -9.
Wow.
You might have survived the immediate hit, but the underlying systemic rot that allowed the shock to damage you in the first place is still there. Your foundation is still fundamentally fragile, and the next shock will destroy you.
So to achieve true anti-fragility, which they define as a massive evolutionary leap forward to a +9, you have to multiply the -3 shock by another -3 action.
Yes. You have to intentionally execute a radically counterintuitive, self-inflicted negative action.
But the logic of that second -3 is where most leaders just freeze. I mean, if a CEO is dealing with a historic crisis and their top strategist says, hey, let's intentionally damage our revenue streams further, that strategist is getting escorted out of the building.
Oh, absolutely. It requires an immense tolerance for short-term pain, which is why it's so rare.
Give us a concrete example.
Let's look at the legacy tech industry. Imagine a legacy software company whose flagship, highly profitable product is suddenly rendered obsolete by a nimble, new AI startup.
Okay, so that's the initial -3 shock.
Right. A fragile +3 response is deeply discounting your old software, laying off staff, and trying to cling to your shrinking market share. You are merely managing a slow death.
The company survives the quarter, but the ecosystem has moved on without them.
Exactly. The required -3 action, the radical negative, is open sourcing your proprietary code.
Wow. You intentionally destroy your own existing, highly profitable revenue model overnight,
Yeah, you give away the very thing your investors value most.
which feels like a catastrophic step backward. Wall Street would panic.
The short-term pain is immense. But by intentionally inflicting that second negative shock on yourself, you fundamentally alter the industry's ecosystem.
Because now everyone is using your code.
Exactly. Because your software is now free and open source, it becomes the ubiquitous foundational standard that everyone, including that threatening new AI startup, now has to build their products upon.
That's brilliant.
You move from being a competitor to being the indispensable infrastructure of the entire market. You force an evolutionary leap to a +9.
That structural pivot is amazing, but it requires a level of ruthlessness that really goes against traditional corporate harmony.
It does.
The sources describe the mindset required for this as egoism for the sake of love. Now, we should be clear, whether you agree with that cutthroat philosophy or not, structurally, AAA argues that prioritizing your own immediate self-preservation is paramount in a crisis.
Yeah, it heavily challenges conventional corporate morality.
It sounds incredibly toxic to the standard concept of teamwork.
It does. But AAA forces leaders to consider the reality of a catastrophic collapse. False heroism, like where one department drains its resources trying to save a failing sister department or waiting for a consensus from a paralyzed committee, invariably leads to systemic death.
Right.
AAA asserts that individuals and distinct units must ruthlessly prioritize securing their own sectors first.
It maps perfectly onto the classic airline safety rule, right? Secure your own oxygen mask before assisting others.
Exactly.
Because if you pass out from lack of oxygen while trying to be a hero, you haven't saved anyone, and you've basically become a deadly liability to the flight crew.
Precisely. If a corporation is populated by decisive individuals operating on an autonomous OODA loop, they do not freeze when the shock hits.
They don't wait for the manual.
They do not wait for a top-down memo from the CEO to tell them how to breathe. They act immediately to secure their immediate domain.
And this decentralized, self-preserving action collectively forms the organizational Fudo no Shinbashira, the unbreakable central pillar.
Yes. By aggressively saving themselves first, they inadvertently create a robust foundation that saves the entire organization.
Okay, that sounds incredible in theory, but let's talk about implementation.
This is where it gets tricky.
Yeah, because if you walk into a Fortune 500 C-suite and tell a group of executives to throw away their control manuals, embrace short-term revenue destruction, and let their employees operate on raw, decentralized survival instinct, they are going to reject you.
Oh, absolutely. Executives are fundamentally addicted to top-down control.
So how does strategist Kong Ming actually install this radical operating system?
They recognize that frontal assaults on corporate ego always fail. If you challenge an executive's reliance on their manuals directly, their intellectual fear walls engage immediately.
They get defensive.
Right. Therefore, strategist Kong Ming employs what they call the Toroi no Mokuba, the Trojan horse strategy.
The Trojan horse.
They do not pitch to the C-suite for corporate strategy budgets. They bypass the heavily guarded front door entirely.
They target the soft underbelly of the corporation. The budgets allocated for corporate social responsibility, ESG initiatives, and family welfare programs.
It's so clever.
They disguise the installation of this aggressive crisis OS as an innocent, family-friendly weekend retreat, an Oyako or parent-child workshop.
It's an incredibly sophisticated psychological operation. And the entire workshop is built around a trap, using that single mathematical concept. -3 times -3 equals 9.
And the mechanism of this trap relies on some staggering OECD data.
This is my favorite part.
It's wild. Statistically, 95% of adults in developed countries, which translates to roughly 57 million adults in Japan alone,
57 million.
cannot logically explain to a child why a negative multiplied by a negative equals a positive.
Consider the psychological breakdown that occurs in that moment.
Yeah, picture it.
You have these high-powered executives, accustomed to total authority, sitting next to their 7-year-old child. The child asks a fundamental question about how the world works, And the executive realizes they have no idea.
They are forced to say, because my teacher told me to memorize the rule.
Exactly. In that single moment, their entire intellectual facade crumbles.
In front of their own kids.
Right. They are exposed to their own cognitive fragility. They realize that their entire professional lives, their leadership styles, are built on rote memorization and blindly following rule books without actually understanding the underlying mechanics.
Their ego defenses completely drop.
And once the cognitive firewall is down, the physical game begins.
Right. The children and parents participate in a spatial exercise. Facing backward in the room represents a negative orientation. Taking physical steps backward represents a negative action.
So the parents are physically acting out the math.
But when you face backward and take steps backward, where does your body actually travel in physical space?
You move forward across the room.
This is the genius of the Trojan horse. While the conscious mind thinks it's just playing a math game with children, a profound subconscious hack is taking place.
Yes. By physically participating, the executives are entirely bypassing their conscious ego. That CEO brain we talked about that demands manuals and safe resilience.
Muscle memory is overriding cognitive learning. They are viscerally, physically learning that leaning into the negative shock, intentionally stepping backward while facing backward, is the biological mechanism for advancing.
They literally install the crisis management OS into their nervous systems.
It's high-level biological and strategic programming disguised as a juice box and crayons weekend retreat.
It's unbelievable. And the success of this Trojan horse strategy brings us to the May 2026 intelligence update from our sources.
Right, because they are scaling this up again.
It reveals the sheer, staggering scale of what AAA is now attempting. They have proven the model on individuals and corporate boards, but they are no longer restricting this to corporate C-suites.
They are taking this anti-fragile OS to the global front lines, specifically the complex disaster zones of India and the Himalayas.
So they're moving past corporate training and attempting to deploy this during immediate massive regional trauma.
But wait, how do you install an operating system into millions of people in the middle of a systemic collapse? You can't run a parent-child math workshop in a disaster zone.
No, you can't. You have to bypass language, logic, and physical workshops entirely. The update details the deployment of a highly specialized acoustic tool, a symphonic track designated Himalayan Sunrise.
An acoustic weapon designed for disaster relief. How does the neurology of that actually work?
It relies on the principles of neuroacoustic entrainment. When a population is enduring the acute trauma of a regional disaster, their left brain, which is the analytical language processing center, is completely overwhelmed by the startle effect.
Just like the pilots in the cockpit.
Exactly. Rational instructions over a loudspeaker are useless. Himalayan Sunrise utilizes specific frequencies and binaural rhythms designed to bypass the left hemisphere entirely. It directly stimulates the right brain's spatial and emotional processing centers.
Wow. So instead of trying to talk people out of their panic, the acoustic frequencies physically shift their nervous system out of that sympathetic freeze state.
Yes.
It takes the raw, paralyzing despair of a massive crisis and entrains the brain waves to convert that panic into the kinetic, unified energy required for an evolutionary leap forward. They are broadcasting an autonomous ODA loop directly into the right brain of regional populations and key decision makers at organizations like UN Women.
They're attempting to future-proof humanity against shocks that haven't even fully materialized yet, fundamentally altering how our species responds to the unpredictable.
But the sources are incredibly clear that accessing this level of strategic power is not a casual self-help exercise.
No, not at all.
Strategist Hongming demands extreme, uncompromising commitment. There is a foundational rule in their charter that states hidden cracks lead to fatal systemic failure.
That rule is absolute. You cannot build a food in an ocean Bashira, an unbreakable central pillar on a foundation of corporate lies, toxic office politics, or hidden vulnerability.
Because the moment the one-ton shock hits, a compromised pillar will not sway. It will snap and the system will die.
And because of this requirement for absolute structural integrity, AA gates access to their full defense OS behind a digital cyber checkpoint, known as a Zakisho, which is managed by a highly advanced AI secretary.
And to pass that digital checkpoint and prove you possess the transparency and resolve required, you must provide a highly classified secret keyword.
Which is hidden.
Now, to you listening, we have seen the keyword buried deep within our sources, but the rules of our source material are strict. We cannot and will not say it out loud on this deep dive.
No, the checkpoint remains locked.
You have to do the intellectual and systemic work to uncover it yourself.
It has been an expansive journey today. We started by diagnosing the fatal flaw of top-down manuals in the Boeing 737 MAX tragedy, proving that rigid cognitive protocols just crumble under sudden sensory overload.
Yep.
We then explored the biological backdoor, seeing how dual-task training allowed a man to survive a one-ton horse kick by bypassing his conscious brain.
The CEO bypass.
Right. We saw how strategist Kong Ming scales that reflex into corporate strategy, utilizing the math of -3 times -3, and tricking executives via family workshops. And finally, we examined the deployment of neuroacoustic OS upgrades across the Himalayas.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Yeah, it's something to think about.
We've spent this entire time talking about how humans must hack their own biology and organizations to build these autonomous ODA loops. But we are rapidly entering an era where artificial intelligence can process data millions of times faster than our reticular spinal tract.
Right.
What happens when AI eventually automates our survival instincts entirely? If we outsource our crisis response to machines, do we lose our biological anti-fragility altogether?
That's a scary thought.
And what happens when the very AI we built to protect us becomes the unpredictable black swan we are no longer equipped to survive?
It is a critical vulnerability to consider as we build the architecture of tomorrow.
When the fire alarm blares, the strobe lights flash, and you have exactly 0.3 seconds before impact, do not reach for the manual. Rewrite your OS. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the rigid systems around you, and we'll see you next time.